Hey gamers, I'm gonna slowpoke your Cloyster till my Bulbasaur. Patrick.
And move over Luke Triton, I'm going to be the new apprentice to Professor Layton, Jason.
Welcome to RPGaymer Episode 7, a podcast about the golden era of gaming. So Jason, we're taking a little twist this time on our discussion in a sense that instead of just talking about games, we're talking about a whole era of games. The golden era, if you will. Why don't you clarify for our audience what we mean about the golden era?
The golden era was this old TV show with these four old ladies, and they went into shenanigans and stuff. Actually, I never watched Golden Girls. I don't even know. Is that right?
I am a bad gay. So I could name two of them if they're...
Wait, why is that like a gay show?
Well, they actually were pretty okay with gay people, and this was the early 90s that it was on. We can fact check that later. So I know there's even an episode about acceptance. So
wonderful.
It's pretty trend setting. And then who doesn't want to be a sassy, drinking all the time old woman? I'm already halfway there. I'm drunk right now. So drunk that we're talking about women instead of video games. No, what do we mean about the golden era of games?
The golden era of games is typically in someone's mind as the earlier games as opposed to modern games. Now it's probably different sorts of systems that you think of. So maybe the original NES, maybe it's the Atari, Genesis. Really, it's going to be the systems that you probably found that were the most definitive for the genres and sort of staple versions of the games that you could think of. For example, for me, I really would refer to as a golden era of games as the generation we saw, the NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis. Those sort of generations of games are when you would refer to as the golden era in my mind.
Okay, so this could be, anyone could have their own opinion on what the golden era is, and in some capacity you could support it, unless you're talking about the Dreamcast. I don't think anybody could actually support that. But
wow, shots fired.
I mean, I loved my Dreamcast, but I think I had it for the solid 8 months that it was producing games. And that was about it.
So you had the entire run, I see.
Yeah, basically. But anyone could argue anything. But I think if you went across the board and asked a lot of people when were the heaviest hitters of video games, you would probably tend to hear a lot of people saying the same thing. Now, we have a little bit of an age bias because we're the same age, and we're a little bit older than I would say the average gamer right now. But I completely agree with you. If I had to think about when we were seeing the best games, the best series, and just the best entry point for everyone, I would definitely say that it's, the Sega, SNES, Game Boy Color. How did you come up with your decision, though?
That's a good point. I think that I kind of lumped some technical generations together because I came up with it with NES, SNES, Genesis, but those are cross-generation there. And it's actually, in lieu of your question you just asked, it was largely because those are the games I started out playing, or the systems I started out playing, rather. I remember playing games with my brothers and having to share our NES. We could only play one at a time, or there was only 2 controllers, but there was 3 of us. So playing games like the original Mario Brothers, Mario 3, Mega Man 1, 2, and 3 on the NES, that's kind of what I grew up with. And then as I was a little bit older, I'm understanding what's happening and I can appreciate these visuals and this storytelling and other stuff that kind of came with the advancements of modernizing games. So for me, the games that really formed my liking of video games were the SNES and Genesis era video games. And they were the most fun to me. And they also kind of harken back now to games I'm playing today that I kind of compare them as, oh, this game is like Super Mario World, or this game is like the first Final Fight, as opposed to saying that this game is I don't know, Bloodstained. It has a basis that is kind of older. So the golden era is probably where you sort of formed your initial opinions about games. And likely slash hopefully those are good video games that have withstood the test of time and that you can still enjoy today.
Yeah, I you hit something there when you were saying like it was kind of the focal point. I think it's the everybody system, or they were the everybody system. And by that I mean I could hand a controller to my mom and we would have Super Mario World in there and she would be able to play it without any explanation. I could be like, yeah, press that button to jump. I wouldn't even probably have to tell her how to move. I think she could just figure it out. And I don't think that is something that you can say about a lot of games today. So everything for the system was just very accessible and familiar. And I think things are a lot more complex now. So I think it being accessible to everyone is one of the reasons too why it's just put up on a pedestal, like Sega and Super Nintendo.
That makes sense. Accessibility is something I actually didn't think of until you said it, but that is kind of the case. Those early games, for example, I brought up Super Mario World. That game was easy for me to play because it's legit 2 buttons. Like you go move with the D-pad and you jump and like use a special fire flower. So it's very easy to pick up and play. If I picked up a game when I was like 4 years...
Jason, if you're not holding down the run button, you're not playing Mario. And Scott and I have had this conversation every time we've played.
It's true.
You have to hold down the run button.
It's true. And
you have to.
But you know what? To your point, because I know you're making a joke, but I'm going to run with it. Literally, You need to... You need to learn that though. And so as you play the game, you realize like holding buttons is also a way to play. Like it does something. So there is that element to it. So anyways, if I was that young, I was maybe 7 or 8 when that game came out. If I had instead picked up, let's just say, Demon Souls and tried to play that game as a young person, I would be much more turned off to games.
Fuck that.
Yeah, it would be so different. And so I think that makes a case for itself right there.
And I think that's what I was saying. Just, I couldn't be like, yo, mom, go get fucked by this skeleton or zombie in Demon Souls right off the bat. She's not going to pwn anything, but if it like we were saying, something like Mario, she could figure it out. For me, a memory that really helped solidify this whole era of great gaming and accessibility was when I was younger. My sister and I had a little bit of a bonding moment where I think she knew I was very lonely because I was just starting a brand new high school and I didn't know anyone yet. I actually don't even think school had started yet. So I pretty much just had home and whoever was at home. She came up with me and we sat and we played Super Mario RPG and I let her play it. And like, I don't really think she had the greatest time because it was an RPG. I don't really think RPGs are always the greatest, like brand new to gaming genre of games. But she was still having a good time and it was still easy for her to play. It was not hard for her to figure out. So I think just that whole purity of gaming is something that we don't tend to see as much anymore.
I agree with that. And I think that something else that can kind of define your golden era of games and how it might change is that memory aspect that you talked about. No matter what you're discussing, video games, your childhood, movies, you're probably thinking the best era / golden era is likely the ones that you had good memories with. So I also did create a lot of great memories with my younger friends and family around video games. I actually have a similar story of Super Mario RPG and playing with my cousin at his place and not really knowing what RPGs were at the time, but seeing this one and being like, wow, you can make Mario like gain extra health points. That's so cool. And it was a neat way to get exposed to that sort of style of video game. And it also made a fun memory that I can always have and I can always cherish. So thinking about that, I did that with the Super Nintendo, not the N64, not the PS2. And I think that those kind of personal touches are really what kind of go into making that golden era different for each person.
This was very hard when Jason and I first started talking about this topic because actually I would think this is the first thing that we planned on doing as a podcast episode aside from the LGBT episode, right? Like this was the episode. So we knew we wanted to do this, but it took a lot of thought into what era of gaming consoles would be the ones that you would put on the highest pedestal. And we were having a little bit of a debate even this week where I thought it would be better if we brought 2 different eras and duked it out and see what was better. And you said like N64, which is honestly what I thought that you were going to say And I was going to bring to the table the like PS2, GameCube, Xbox. So it really does kind of go with that whole, it is a matter of perspective, and it's those memories and it's the games that make it. But once I found out that like we both were primarily going to go with Super Nintendo, Sega, and Game Boy, like it really just felt right. There was just something really right about that. So if you aren't familiar with those systems, for
Get
me,
familiar with them.
this right, please do. This is when we started to see a lot more refinement in home gaming. Like people know what Nintendo games look like with the 8-bit gaming. They were very, very, very simple. The original Nintendo didn't really have hardware to support like these better looking games or these more engaging games, and they didn't have the polish. So that's one of the reasons why I think like Super Nintendo and Sega are so great, is because officially you felt like you had an arcade, because at the time, you would, if you wanted quality games, you would go to the arcade. You
Yeah.
think of, the original Ninja Turtles arcade game and the X-Men arcade game. You didn't see things like that at home until you had the Sega and the Super Nintendo, and all of a sudden it was like, bam, now we have these really nice looking games. And these are, like you said, these are the games that created that ripple effect. I don't really think you can look at a Nintendo game and be like, oh, here's a reference from this Nintendo game in current gaming, but you can still do that in Super Nintendo games. Were there any games for you that really stuck out as like, here is a thing that I'm currently seeing now?
Something I think really harkens back to that golden era, or really the SNES Genesis era of games, is the platforming genre almost entirely. I think that you saw a ton of those games on those systems, and even the NES before it, and really you could argue the Atari and stuff like that too. I think that it was it was definitive of that generation, and I think likely it is that way because it really capitalized on what those systems and that hardware could produce that would remain fun and engaging to any skill level, like we had referenced before. So let's just use Mario or Sonic, for example. Those games were fun because they capitalized on what the Genesis and Super Nintendo could do at the time in terms of actual gameplay, the music, the visuals, everything all together. So when you're looking at a similar game nowadays, like the newer Shantae games, they definitely harken back to that style, not only visually, but in the same vein that they're capitalizing on what made an SNES game popular. Difficult platforming with a reward at the end for putting forth physical, dexterous effort to actually get to that location. So it makes me feel similar feelings of when I was younger doing the same thing with Sonic the Hedgehog. And that's cool. And I know that gamers nowadays might not get that feeling because they haven't played those older games. But if you have played them, you almost have an extra layer of sort of fun factor for these new titles that is really, really, really great. And it harkens back to the golden era of games. It harkens back to your personal feelings and why you enjoyed them and how you enjoy games nowadays, and probably why you have preference for the games you're playing on modern consoles based on what you played earlier.
Are you kind of saying, when you're talking about people not knowing this era, that it's not as well regarded as we think it is? Or like, do you think that in all sincerity, it would be the popular opinion? Like if we somehow were managed to survey 10,000 gamers, would you think that people would say that this is the pinnacle era?
That's a spicy question. I think that they probably would, because I feel like gamers are probably conditioned to think that the golden era, in quotations, is NES, SNES, Genesis, Game Boy. It's probably that time. And I think they might think of that because golden era just colloquially probably means it's older. So you're thinking of older games. But an older game to me and you is definitely that era. But an older game to like my nephew is probably the PS2. So it's very drastically different in what it can actually mean. But I do think that if we're describing or asking 10,000 random gamers that question, I bet they would probably point to that time, knowing mostly that it's because it was influential to modern games and consoles, but also probably knowing that it's likely the right answer, if you will, just given the fact that it's older and they were kind of the progenitors of what you're seeing nowadays. Like you wouldn't have Mario Odyssey if Mario Brothers 3 or whatever didn't exist.
I think it's funny that you say if you asked your nephew, because I talk to my students, my nerd squad, as I call them,
Nice.
about games all the time. And, they talk about old games like Halo,
Oh my god.
or yeah, Mario Sunshine and Final Fantasy 10. And like, I get it. I don't get like too grossed out when they say that, because it's that whole, when you were bored in perspective. But when you're thinking about the grand scheme of gaming, it's different for us because we were at the birth of gaming. I think
Yeah.
the original Nintendo came out the year I was born. And yeah, there was Atari before that, but games were so minimal at that point that I don't know if you would really call it gaming. It just was so minute in what they did, but we got to see the full development.
You bring up a good point, which I think we should talk about. The Atari did come out before the NES, duh. But I think that you wouldn't have some games that we have nowadays if that sort of setting wasn't made. But I do think that you wouldn't have that golden era being the NES, Genesis, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, whatever you want to call it, if those other games weren't there to show what it could be. So I think that seeing the wonderful games that came out, all the RPGs, Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, just to name a couple, Shining Force on the Genesis, like those are considered golden era titles because they are great for what they do, and they all came out at the same time. So for the Atari, yeah, you might have gotten a crappy port of Pac-Man, but you got like Pitfall, which is cool. But when they're so few and far between, it just doesn't make you feel proud or cool or taken care of as a gamer when there's not enough to really justify owning a console or really enjoying it, or to harken back to one of our older episodes, to really call yourself a gamer if there's no reason to really do that in the first place. So these older titles give you the reason to do that because it makes you feel good and happy and satisfied when you play and beat these RPGs, or when you win at these fighting games, what have you. And I think that's what really makes it stand out and really makes it fun to be a gamer overall, no matter when you played.
Well, it's funny too, because from an RPG perspective, because I wouldn't say that we're primarily an RPG podcast, but we're actually primarily an RPG podcast. And behind me, I have a copy of Game Informer's 100 top RPGs of all time. And every single major Super Nintendo, Sega, and Game Boy Color / Game Boy RPG is on there. They're all on that list, where the rest of them, for the rest of the consoles, it's a spattering. It's like a couple PS3 of all of them, a couple PS2 of all of them, a couple. I mean, I wouldn't say Xbox tends to be, especially back in the day, there weren't too many RPGs, but like the highest representation is in those 3 consoles, like even for RPGs alone, and it's not just RPGs.
For those games, like you referenced, Final Fantasy, we'll run with that. But Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, Shining Force, those RPGs have kind of withstood the test of time, and they are still talked about today. But what about them really resonates with you, and why do you consider them to be so good? Is there like a sort of connecting factor between all of them, something that really stands out that makes them great even against the PS4s and Xbox Ones of today?
If I had to really single out some of the major things, I think they weren't trying too hard to be anything. And that's where I really get caught up in a lot of modern, or not even modern games. I'd say like, what gen of consoles would you say the Super Nintendo and Sega were? Like Gen 2 consoles? If I had to like say, what was happening beyond that generation of consoles, some of the games were just way too overly ambitious. So we get a lot more flashiness and not as much substance. And I think a lot of that is because all of a sudden we were going into 3D worlds, and we were voice acting, and it left a lot more room for error.
Oh yeah,
where
good point.
When we have these games like you would see on the Super Nintendo, they knew, and the Sega, they knew exactly what they could do, and they literally executed them to the best of their ability. And I think that's one of the reasons that they're so strong. I want to say, like, it's partially the ambiance and the setting of the games, and it's the music, and it's a lot of things, so that's why I don't want to say it's one thing, because it is everything. But it's because they knew the limitations, they knew how far they could push it, and it was just a fully polished, completed game. And now sometimes we're not even getting completed games.
Day one, 80 gigabyte patch.
Right, exactly. And we just didn't have to worry about those things back then. So I think that's one of the reasons for me, I'm such a fan of this era. And like for all three, I had all three of these systems in some capacity or another. Like before I owned my own Super Nintendo, I would borrow it from my cousin, and I owned a Sega and a Game Boy, and I just immediately knew that these were incredible. Like I remember going to bed, and I don't know what it was about like wishing on a night sky, but like I would always just go to my window and look out into the stars. And of all the things to wish for, I was like, please let me get a Super Nintendo, because that would be
Aww.
the coolest thing. And they just knew that they were something good, but I knew that they were still good when the next generations came out. So like PS1 and PS2 and Game Boy Advance, that era, some of the games that were on the Sega and the Super Nintendo were already being remade, or they
Mhm.
were getting their sequels.
Or even that,
So it
or
was,
even that way, it's like advertised as it's like an SNES game. Golden Sun is like a Super Nintendo RPG, and that's just very telling in my opinion.
well, and it's funny that you say that, because I remember seeing Golden Sun, and there is a game like in between the Shining Force series and Golden Sun called Beyond the Beyond.
Oh yeah.
And I never played that. Wasn't familiar with it until afterward. But I looked at Golden Sun and I was like, that motherfucker looks like Shining Force. And then, I found out like, oh my God, it's by the same creators as Shining Force. That's freaking awesome. I totally saw the impact, like how the characters were standing,
Mhm.
the facial portraits, like everything
Yeah, the
about
battle
how
system
they
looks like identical almost.
Exactly. And there was just so much of that reference that I just completely got it, that like that's one of the ways that you've created something great, because you have these newer systems and these newer games, and you're still drawn back to that like pure era, and always saying like, oh yeah, this reminds me of this from that Super Nintendo Sega era. How about you? When were you like standing this?
Did you say when was I standing this? Oh my
Yes.
god. Wow, that's a good way to put it. I think for me, it was probably when I started to get my own games and consoles that I didn't share with my brothers that I realized I was kind of buying, purchasing, looking for, renting, whatever it was, the games that I knew I enjoyed. So, for example, when I got my own N64, I really wanted, and I was greatly disappointed, I really wanted games that were going to be like Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy, and there's like none of them on that console, FYI. And so it was not that great, but I knew that's what I was looking for. And I also knew, hey, I really like Super Mario World. Maybe I'll like Super Mario 64, even though it's very different. And yeah, I loved it. It was great. And I knew going in kind of the quality that I would get because I had a basis in the older games. So you for example, Patrick, you earlier mentioned people were saying that their older games were Halo. So I think that that's fine. And I bet that they probably purchased another game comparing it to Halo, another shooter, for example, like let's just say Call of Duty Modern Warfare. And they were probably pleased because they got something that they knew harkened back to a time where they really enjoyed and they really liked those games. So I was similar to that around that PS2 N64 era.
It's funny that you're talking about Halo as well, because I think the genre that was probably the least represented on console systems until like Xbox and PlayStation was the
The
first person
shooter.
shooter.
Yeah.
And they are so popular now, and they've been so popular for the past 15, 16 years, that because that was pretty much, GoldenEye was great. I'm not knocking anything like GoldenEye, but I feel like Halo was the first one where it was like, wow, like just knocked it out of the park. That older gamers might say like, well, that was the crux of the best era of gaming because of something
Mm-hmm.
like that. But that's just one genre. Like if you and I were only talking about RPGs, we do talk about RPGs a lot, but if we only had RPGs to support our point, I don't think that we would be able to validly make our point. Unfortunately, there are so many different games that we can talk about, and I feel like maybe I'm speaking for the younger crowd there too of what they think is the best. But you know, I don't think we're so biased in the sense that we wouldn't be able to support it.
You bring up something I didn't really think about until just now, but maybe there is something that we could talk about here in terms of the golden era of a genre in a sense. And I think that arguably you could probably say the golden era for a shooter was probably Halo, Halo 2. You might even say GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, whatever it looks like. But then I guess what is the overarching golden era of games? And I think that's where, like you're saying, it's difficult to find where that really is. And it's probably much more personal as opposed to it's definitely 1994. Like you're never going to find that specific answer.
Right. And I remember like also in our planning of this, you wanted to include the PS1, and it would make sense if you did, because if we're talking span of years, the Super Nintendo and the PS1 existed at the exact same time.
Yeah, that's true.
Like was Super Mario RPG came out like the second year of the PS1, I think. So it's hard to nail it down to, like you said, just years or a year. You really have to open it up. And I think by system grouping is probably the best way, because we tend to see systems phase in and phase out at the same time.
And then you judge them accordingly based on all their games they had.
Exactly. Speaking of judging, and because we've talked about younger folk quite a few times, what would you say to someone who is younger or possibly newer to gaming, even if they're not younger, in order to get them into or to appreciate this golden era that we're talking about?
There's a couple places I would probably start. I think I would first clarify by saying, now back in my day, this was cutting edge visuals and this is what we would play. But I think if I was really to try to get someone to be influenced by SNES Genesis games, I would try to tell them to look at what the game is doing with the software or hardware that it had and how it relates to the games you like today. So for example, if we're looking at the original 3 Streets of Rage on the Genesis, and if someone really got into Streets of Rage during the modern Streets of Rage 4, great on them. I think that they could look back and see why the game was fun or why it stood out to them. It's the same idea. So just to tell someone this game visually looks different, but it plays the exact same way, or you're going to essentially be hitting the same brain synapses that's going to make you enjoy that game and get that same serotonin dose in your head. That's probably what I would try to say, but in a more kid-friendly and non-scientific and nerdy way.
If you're wanting to know why there's a kangaroo bartender in one of the levels of Streets of Rage 4, play Streets of Rage 3.
Exactly. And but you bring up actually a funny point. Like that's part of the reason why the modern games call back to the old ones again. One, because that's the whole point of, I guess, a modern game like that, it's calling back. But two, it's to hit the nostalgia factor that those gamers playing it are going to enjoy and want anyways. So to know that I've had this memory that I could wait, God, how many years is that? 20 years to like then laugh at and be like, oh yeah, I remember when I was 10 and I enjoyed this game first. It's a cool feeling. So for a younger gamer to kind of experience that, it's going to be a little bit lost. So I think you have to kind of get them to why you like the game in the first place. Streets of Rage example, it was hella fun. It was 2 players. You could play as a kangaroo. There was all these ridiculous things that you could do. You could have so much fun with that game. And that's how I would try to get someone to really enjoy it. Think of it from the
you
time era.
You can play as the kangaroo if you beat up the kangaroo.
It's true. You had to beat them first.
So if I had to talk to someone younger, I would probably be like, this is the game that led to your parents having sex and having you. That's what I would say. That was probably Mario Kart.
Wait, so you're telling me that your parents were having a fun time playing Mario Kart and then thought, you know what? We're going to go make Patrick. And then they made Patrick.
No, not my parents, but like the listener that I'm like, yo, you should go back and check out Super Nintendo games. It's definitely like, yeah, your parents were like doing it while they were playing these games.
I see. They were in college. It was a rough night of studying. And so they kicked back with Mario Kart and sex.
Yes, exactly.
Well, obviously. I mean, yeah. I didn't say that because like, duh.
I would put it really simple and say something like, if you're looking for games that are high value and low time commitment, this is where you want to look, because there are so many games that are 20, 30 hours plus. And if you're looking for something to just like crack open and you're just going to have a good time no matter what, these are those games.
Is that a cat?
And thank you, Tuck, my cat, for your input.
Lovely. Love it.
Okay. We've danced around it quite a bit. You've mentioned a few like Streets of Rage and whatnot, the big standouts of this era. let's just go ahead and start with RPGs. What are you throwing in the ring? Like, if someone had to check out, if we have newer listeners, or if we have listeners who have never picked up a Sega controller or Super Nintendo or a Game Boy, what are these games that they should be playing?
Definitely. I think that this is a little bit easier of a question for this genre because I feel like the SNES era, Genesis era is very well regarded for its RPGs. So this isn't going to be too difficult, but there are a ton of them. So if I had to hammer down a few, I'm going to defer the Genesis ones to you, but I would say probably you're going to say Shining Force. But outside of that, on the Game Boy, I think one people might forget every now and then, even though it's huge, is Pokemon. That was the first place we saw that, was on the Game Boy. The first one was there. That's a huge one.
Absolutely. That game holds up so well still, and it's even better in Pokemon Yellow because you can literally start with Pikachu and get all 3 starters. And on the Game Boy Color, the original Silver and Gold were on there, and Kanto is in those as well. So I mean, like, it's really
pretty expansive.
It is an expansive game. I remember beating that, and all of a sudden it was just like, oh shit, I get to go back and get all original 8 badges. Like, that's fucking crazy.
It is
that
crazy.
Was so crazy.
If you're looking at other RPGs, Final Fantasy, like, you got to mention Final Fantasy 2, which was called on the SNES, which was actually 4, and then Final Fantasy 3 on the SNES was actually 6. Those are
let's explain that here really quickly. So they didn't think that Final Fantasy was going to have a lot of commercial success in America until other RPGs were starting to like become more prominent, and they're like, oh my god, people in the West play RPGs. But Final Fantasies 2 and 3 had already released, and they didn't want to throw Americans off and be like, well, why are we getting Final Fantasy 4? So they called Final Fantasy 4 Final Fantasy 2. And then for whatever reason, they thought that the job system in Final Fantasy 5 was going to be too complex. So when we got Final Fantasy 6, it was called Final Fantasy 3. So that's basically just like the most fucked up situation ever.
Yeah, it was weird. And thankfully they just stopped that. And we've since, actually, ironically enough, been getting every Final Fantasy game re-released every single year. So you could play all of them whenever you want on any possible machine ever.
I would fly to Square Enix and punch them in the balls.
Stop it.
Yeah, I love you, but give us all of your games.
Please don't. The other RPG you got to talk about is Chrono Trigger. I feel like it's often regarded as one of the best RPGs of all time. It's often regarded as one of the best SNES games of all time. It's often regarded as one of the best games of all time. That's a really, really big one. And if I had to point to one from that era, I would say that's where you're going to go.
Yeah, so I refer to these 3 RPGs as the Holy Trinity of the SNES RPGs, just because they're just so pure and perfect. But Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, and Super Mario RPG.
Oh yeah,
like I could cycle through those games and just nonstop play them, and I think I would still appreciate them and love them as much as the first time I played them. And Final Fantasy VI, I think I've played 14 times.
Wow.
On yeah, no joke, on various platforms, just because it's that wonderful of a game. But in all 3 of these games, Chrono Trigger and Super Mario RPG are so charming.
Yeah, very charming.
Final Fantasy VI, I think, over 4 had a cohesive, high graphical quality game with really good story that started out like right away and really pushed the bill and built right away. We saw a lot of depth in them. They're just great. And Chrono Trigger having multiple endings, I think, was probably the first RPG. Yeah, high replayability. Just all, like, you can't go wrong with those. Someone might argue you might be missing the aspects of customization for these games because you don't really get to customize your characters that much. I think 6 is probably the closest with the magic system, but it just didn't matter because you were along for the ride and you knew you didn't really need it that much anyways, just because they're not going to take you 40, 50, 60 hours to play. You were just going to get through them and have a great time.
Yeah, and to your point, we brought this up earlier, the SNES games were taking advantage of what they could do at the time. So you couldn't get the fully expansive customization options you can see in like Mass Effect. So in Final Fantasy VI, you got 20 characters that you can be, and that you could play the style that you wanted, depending on the story, blah, blah, blah. But it took advantage of what it could do. And visually, it took advantage of what the SNES could put out and the music that it could make. So when you're thinking of games like, let's say the PS4's God of War in 2018, that remake, people consider that to be an amazing, sometimes maybe even a perfect game. And it probably is because it's visually stunning for the PS4. The music is great. The action is good. It's a good PS4 game. But it's never going to look the same as Final Fantasy VI because that was made decades before. But it doesn't mean it's any less different. It does what is right at that time. And that's why the game is considered so well and lives up. And you talk about it nowadays still. It's because it stands out for those reasons.
Yeah, like we were saying, it's the best of what it could be. So, and speaking of the best of what they could be, you're correct. Shining Force 2 is a game for the Sega that I will always recommend to people, especially if you're into tactics RPGs. And it's very different than most because I feel like tactics RPGs kind of get into the very, very dark era with like a lot of loss, where Shining Force 2 is very vibrant and bright and beautiful and cheery and fun. And that's not to say it's not a serious game. It's actually can be pretty challenging, but it's just a different kind of like echelon of tactics RPG. And then the other one is just Phantasy Star 4. That's just like, I never thought a Sega game could have that kind of storytelling and character development, but it is basically like playing a serious, solid anime. And I know you haven't played either of those games, but I think you definitely, Jason, you should.
Yeah.
So they're just perfection.
I take your recommendations very highly.
Okay. Non-RPGs. This is going to be quite the hell of a list. So let's go. What do these systems have outside of RPGs? What made them so great?
I think a big standout for me is the Genesis title. It's the first 3 Sonic the Hedgehog games. Those games are amazing. And I think that they're again wonderful examples of what the Genesis can do, but ultimately they're just really fun. They still are great nowadays. And that's the reason why people are saying that Sonic hasn't had a good game for so long. It's because those games were great and then they weren't able to fully emulate them on later on consoles, Dreamcast and all that, rest in peace. So that's a big one. They set
the bar way too high with what they did, which is awesome because like that's why they're so memorable, because they're, like we said, just so strong. They're such strong entries. Like how do you make something that competes with those?
If I'm going to lump that together with another platformer, I have to include Super Mario World. I know I mentioned it earlier in this podcast, but that game is perfection. The music is good, the visuals are good, the level design is great, and it's so fun to play nowadays. If you haven't played it, I think you can still get it on the Switch. It might be on there, but that game is wonderful.
If not, you can get the Super Nintendo Classic. What's it called? Is that what it's called? The Super Nintendo Classic?
Yeah, that's on there.
Super Nintendo guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Best wedding gift ever. And it just, anyone can pick up that Mario and play it. And it has, different paths to go through the game.
It has such good music. Oh, I'm just humming it right now.
It's great. For me, because I was a little more on the Sega side before I was on the Super Nintendo side, games that stood out to me, Vector Man.
Oh, Vector Man. It looks so cool.
That's a side-scrolling shooter game, and they tried to emulate 3D, which is not really something that like the Sega could necessarily do. So they basically like tricked the way the animation was, where your character, everything was basically made out of spheres, and just the way that they did it made it look like it had this really cool 3D pop effect.
Yeah, it worked. It was cool.
It's super cool. And then the other game, which is one of the best games I've ever played in my entire life, and there are so many games that refer to this, is Gunstar Heroes.
Oh, that's a good one. Oh my god, we got to get more of those games.
If you like Cuphead,
it's very similar.
You have to play Gunstar Heroes. Now Cuphead is a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
But Gunstar Heroes is just a blast. Like it's just a pick up with your best buddy, arcade style shooting, blowing up everything, awesome bosses game. It's just so good.
What other genres stick out for you?
I feel like the snipers that are in the distance for not saying this game yet are about to shoot us, so I'm going to say it now, but A Link to the Past.
Oh yeah, that's my next one too, don't worry.
I just feel like we don't really need to say much, because that is, I think, aside from Chrono Trigger, considered just one of the best games of all time. It's on almost every list of the top 10 best games of all time. I don't consider Zelda games RPGs. I'm on that side of the fence where I think they're more like action adventure puzzle games than they are RPG. But it's really just, and was that a launch title, or was it just pretty close to launch?
I'm not sure on that one.
I know it was early Super
Definitely
Nintendo, and
early.
for a
Yeah.
game of that caliber to come out and be that strong it's just such a good game. I don't want to beat it into the ground too much just because everyone should know. But if you're a Zelda fan and you haven't played that game, you need to get it. And then you need to get the sequel on the 3DS, Link Between Worlds, and play that because that is also epic.
A Link to the Past also set a groundwork for essentially an entire genre of game, but really the half category of the Zelda games that we see. So a lot of games are 3D Zeldas, which are based probably on Ocarina of Time, if we're being honest, or 2D Zeldas, which are based on A Link to the Past. So it's a similar style, it's a similar gameplay, and it all started there. So if you want to see where it starts and also just play a really damn good game, that's where you're going to play.
I kind of like the 2D Zeldas more too. I just feel like there's something about, again, not being over ambitious and just really sticking to pushing the limits of what you can do and the charm that comes with that. It just is such a strong, good game.
I agree with you. That should be a topic
Uh,
later on. We discuss which Zeldas are better because I have opinions.
oh yeah, I'm sure we're gonna have an episode on it. I think the only other one I really want to bring up, which if we're leaving off some of your favorite games, we definitely want to hear from you. So please berate the fuck out of us. But the other big one for me is Turtles in Time.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I kind of forgot about that game. Wow, I feel
Yeah,
bad.
so I think that is again one of those games, kind of like Streets of Rage, where it was just the perfect beat 'em up. Like you really couldn't do anything to make it better. Like it was
Yeah,
just the best of what it could be. And at the time, the Ninja Turtles were so big.
yeah, they're big.
I feel like they were in more of a full swing with their comics. The cartoons were a little bit better then, and the movies were coming out around that time too. So it was a really good time for Ninja Turtles. But that game is just so much fun. It's just so much fun.
I think if we can get a few rapid fire games, I'm just going to throw them out there and we're just going to leave them and then we're going to move on. So I
Sure.
have to say Super Metroid is a big one. The first
Yeah.
three Mega Man X games, those are big ones. And I also want to give a shout out to the three Donkey Kong countries on the SNES. Those were all
Danky
Donkey Kong. Those are all really good ones. Earlier, you mentioned that you enjoyed the game Cuphead, or you recommended it to people who had liked Gunstar Heroes. Do you have any other recommendations for games like that are influenced by those older titles?
Yeah, I'm gonna stick mostly with RPGs here, just because again, it's like the highlight of my gaming.
Mhm.
And I still think you can see a lot of references in the older games and the newer games, but I think the ones that hold up really well. So I would say if you like the Trails of Cold Steel series, I recently got into that. It because of how character driven the games are, I would say check out Fantasy Star 4
Really?
because yeah, I mean like of course, Trails of Cold Steel has the ability to push it so much further, but I feel like you really get that huge appreciation of who the characters are in Phantasy Star 4. And for those of you who haven't played it, if you're familiar with RPGs, especially the Super Nintendo ones, what made Phantasy Star 4 different was they had illustrated panels that would pop up almost like comic book panels, that would overlay on whatever area you were in to show the emotion of what was going on. So there weren't any cutscenes at the time. So it was basically their version of cutscenes where all of a sudden these panels would pop up and they'd be like drawings of what was going on with the characters. And they were just really good. I feel like it's a good comparison to Trails of Cold Steel, again, just because it's that depth of character. The other one is if you like Fire Emblem, especially some of the newer ones, I really, again, think you should try out Shining Force because it was the other system's tactics RPG, and it's not the same in the sense that there's a lot of precision that goes into Fire Emblem, which is what makes it such a good game. Shining Force doesn't have that in the exact same way. It's a little bit more approachable for everyone, but it's still a great tactics game that I think anybody would enjoy if they like tactics games. I think what's sad about my examples though is that they're gone. And that's really hard for me because you have these excellent series like Shining Force went on for a little while on this what are the two
The
systems?
Sega CD and the Saturn.
Thank you. Shining Force went on to the Sega CD and the Saturn, but I think since those systems didn't succeed in the West, the series pretty much ended there.
Hmm.
And then Fantasy Star went to Phantasy Star Online, but you can't really draw a comparison. I mean, they're just not the same.
Yeah, it's a
game.
drastically
You can't
different
compare
type
them.
of experience.
So seeing these older series die out is really hard because you fanboy something and all of a sudden it doesn't come out. It's like a band separating, and all of a sudden all the CDs that you have, the music that you listen to, it still has meaning, but you never get to see the continuation. What about you? What are some of the ones that you just kind of noticed disappeared that you wish were still around?
If I'm trying to think of games that I really miss, I think the first thing I'm thinking of is just the older style in general. I know it's a cop-out answer, but if I'm looking at RPGs, for example, I do kind of miss the simpler times when it wasn't super duper serious, when you could have villains that were, granted, very evil, like Kefka in Final Fantasy VI, but were still like fun and enjoyable to kind of experience. It wasn't super deep with this huge philosophical plot. He was just an insane clown. And I miss that type of game sometimes. I sometimes I just don't want to invest so much in what I'm playing. I want to just unwind and kind of relax and chill at home. And when you have to set up this whole system and put on your headset and do all these things and hope the game loads and you need to reinstall it, like that sort of, I sound like an old man. Like that sort of thing is what I'm really kind of missing from games nowadays.
So you miss it back in the day when like bad guys were just bad and we didn't really need an explanation for it because they were just bad.
Sometimes, because I grew up saving Princess Peach and I know that Bowser kidnapped her, and that's like the only plot that I needed to really enjoy my Friday afternoon. And sometimes that's kind of what I want to play, and you don't get that anymore with these newer games.
I agree with you. If you think of something like all of the new Final Fantasies, you have these bosses that are being influenced by higher beings, and you get the whole philosophy behind what they're doing, and it gets
such a grand scale of things.
Yeah, and it's so nonsensical. And I agree with you. Like, I think it's cool when that's done well and when all the pieces click together, but we don't tend to see that very often. So sometimes it's nice when like, oh yeah, this giant alien being fell to the sky in 65,000 BC and or so 65 million BC, and now it's destroying the world from the inside. It's just like we have this evil Lavos creature like in Chrono Trigger, and it's just evil. Evil is evil, and that's it.
That's all I ask, really. And one other thing that is actually kind of positively changing, I really liked the beat 'em up genre, and it absolutely was amazing during that time. And it was also amazing in the arcades, which we haven't talked about too much in this podcast. But the beat 'em up genre kind of lived in the 90s and it kind of died in the 90s. But we are seeing it coming back now. So we referenced Streets of Rage 4, and I know we've talked about the new Turtles game that they're making from that same team. I also believe that they're re-releasing Zombies Ate My Neighbors today as we're recording this.
So, I think it came out yesterday or today.
Perfect. So like these new games are coming back, and it's that genre that we're seeing again. And I really hope that it takes off and people enjoy it take advantage of what the PS4, PS5, Xbox Ones, what they can do. Online play, like matchmaking, RPG systems that make you level up and keep playing the games again and again. These are the things that I want to see, because that genre is a golden era of gaming genre that I think kind of died out, that I am happy people are getting to experience again.
Yeah, more retro revivals. And if you don't know what a retro revival is, go back and listen to episode 3. Yeah.
Shameless plugs. Tell us your thoughts on the golden era of gaming over on Twitter and Instagram at HeyRPGaymer. And while you're at it, Patrick and I would super appreciate if you're able to leave a review for our podcast on whichever platform you're listening on. It helps us reach more people and lets us know that you're enjoying our content. Patrick and I have been playing a new game together on our stream, which you can definitely follow on Twitch. And we wanted to talk about that a little bit right now because we're both playing the same game. And that game is Dying Light. It's an older game, I think 2013, 2014, but we're just playing it now.
It's
so old, I know.
So old.
It's someone's golden era. And we
bashing some motherfucking zombie heads.
Exactly. We're playing the parkour zombie game. So why don't you kind of take it away with your initial thoughts and what you're enjoying so far?
Well, Dying Light is zombies and it's parkour. That's all right. What do you think?
Literally it. I mean, that I couldn't have said it better myself. So there we go.
I actually really like it. I was very nervous because I remember reading and watching reviews at the time. I was like, it sounds okay, but it doesn't sound that refined. But it was on super sale when we
Yeah.
got it. So we both kind of agreed, like, yeah, we should probably just check this out. And it's fun. Like, if you haven't played this game, you can get it for really cheap right now. The sequel's coming out really soon and it's really cheap. And it's just really cool to go around this like remote area of wherever you are. The voice acting is pretty good, though I would say that there are parts where it's really strange because you're definitely somewhere in the Middle East, right? Wouldn't you say?
I think so. Yeah.
And some people are just like completely American English voices.
That's
so
true.
That's very strange. But the parkour element very rarely doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And the combat sometimes feel a little weird, but it's nice playing a game like that where it's not about the gun and not senselessly like mowing down zombies with unlimited ammo or a high amount of ammo that you would never have. It's really like using melee weapons and things that you can craft and making them better.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I think that the reason why I like the game too, for literally the reasons that you stated, but also I feel like you're always able to do something. So you're always either leveling up your combat skills or your parkour skills, or you're progressing story, or you're making and or finding materials to like make stuff. So there's always something happening. And regardless of that, there's something happening around you. So even though you might be in a safe zone, there's definitely zombies right outside that safe zone. And while we're talking about the zombies, there's definitely your special infected, if you will. I think they call them nightmares that come out at night. Go figure.
And that they are.
Yeah, that they are. And they're a challenge in their own right. But I'm also really happy that the zombie hordes, just the regular zombies, aren't really throwaways. They're still kind of formidable, and maybe that's because we're early in the game, but there was a couple times where we were playing where there would be 7 or 8 zombies there, and I'm like, no problem, I'm just gonna Mario hop over them, but like I missed, and so one zombie kind of bites you or like grabs you, and so you have to shake them off. But while they're doing that, the other zombies are like fucking you up. And so it was neat to think like, wow, everything here is kind of a disaster zone that like I everything is kind of dangerous. So that felt good. It didn't make it feel like I'm an all powerful deity in this zombie land. It made it kind of feel like I'm just a dude that's trying to survive. And that was a fun feeling.
It's also hilarious when you're nowhere near Jason when this is happening and you're just listening to him die, but not actually watching him die.
See, usually I get mad at Patrick for running off ahead because it's like, you just got to pay attention and have more game sense, Patrick. But in this game, I do feel like there is a time where like you just got to go, or there could be something like there was actually one time where we kind of got separated because there was too many zombies in one place, and like we just happened to split. But the game still works in that sense, like that they clearly thought if that's what's going to happen. So you and I can get back together, or the zombies will start to look at me instead of you. And I thought it was smart. So they do a lot of good things in Dying Light.
Yeah, the nightmare chase is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The first actual night where you're very far away from your home base, and Jason and I knew that shit was about to hit the fan, so we just mad dash back to the home base. And like at this point in the game, it's one hit KO for those guys. I'm pretty sure if they just grab you, I don't know, I haven't been killed by one of them yet.
Wow, okay.
But like we just skirted different ways and dashed as quickly as possible, and it was very high intensity and thrilling. And I haven't played a game like that where you're super mobile but it's super high intense. Usually it's something like Resident Evil where your character is like in caution health and you're gimping to a safe area. This was like you're like trying to dash as fast as you can, which it's just a great moment.
So not the Resident Evil punch a helicopter type of game?
Punch a helicopter? You mean punch a boulder?
Oh, punch a boulder. Oh my god, I'm literally thinking of the end of Resident Evil 2, and then I'm juxtaposing Resident Evil 5.
No boulder punching yet.
Not yet. Oh yeah, we don't know yet. It could be.
It could be. I'm just gonna do that in our next stream. But you should definitely check us out if you want to hear me scream like a little bitch. Welcome back to part 2 of RPGaymer. As usual, we're going to play another game, and believe it or not, this time I did not plan the game. So feel free to judge away because Jason planned it this time. Jason, what are we playing?
Oh my god, here we go. We are going to play what I have dubbed the Modern Golden Era. So in this game, what we're doing is each picking a title that released in the Modern Era and the Golden Era, or a genre in both of them. And we're going to be deciding which one we'd recommend more to a player that hasn't played any of them before. So to kind of give you an example, I might say to Patrick, hey Patrick, my friend has never played Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES or Super Mario Odyssey on the Switch, and no other Mario games in between them. These are the only two games he can play. Which one would you recommend more?
And it's like you can only play one, right? Like it's not like a play this and this.
Yeah, you can only play one. So you're going to kind of look at what the game does best. Is it better for a new player to experience it on the older systems? And maybe it's actually more refined so much that the newer system is better. But the idea is there's influence from a Golden Era game onto a Modern Era system or title. And which one do you think is better?
All right. Well, do you want to go ahead and take it away and start us off?
For sure. I'm going to ask Patrick two titles, and he's going to pick of the two which one he would recommend most to someone that hasn't played any games in that genre. So starting off, Patrick, we're going to be looking at The Legend of Zelda. And my two titles I want you to debate on are A Link to the Past and Breath of the Wild.
For me, that's just really easy to pick because we already said like what the epitome of a great Zelda game is. So I definitely would stick with A Link to the Past. And the reason why, thinking of my husband, who's the average gamer, like just kind of like the average Joe of gaming, he gets very overwhelmed by the openness of a game like Breath of the Wild, where he could go anywhere and he sees the value in that. But it's also crippling because he only wants to spend so much time gaming. So having to decide, is this something that's really going to drive me forward, or is this area going to be too hard? You don't have to worry about something like that in A Link to the Past.
Yeah, you
it's
physically can't go there. It's just
right.
blocked off.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there are a few times where you can go to an area where it's just kind of like you probably shouldn't go here, but the game literally labels you the order that you should be doing the dungeons, so it's very clear. And it's just a lot more simple. You don't have to worry about things like Breath of the Wild has weapon durability, which I very much so love, but I am more than the average gamer. I like more complex systems than that. I think the only thing that's a complex system that would be even close to that is just the magic in A Link to the Past, and that's pretty much it.
I kind of assumed you would pick Link to the Past. This was an easy one, but I think for me, I might actually pick Breath of the Wild over Link to the Past. I do think they're drastically different games, but I think for the influence of what someone's going to enjoy nowadays, even based on the nostalgia factor of the older titles, I still think Breath of the Wild is probably better. And I know I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for that too. If I had to pick two, it would be very difficult, but I would lean towards Breath just because I think it's the more engaging and thought out title for what it's doing. I think it's really great for what it is. And I'm sure you would agree that it's a great game. It's just when you're picking an A+ versus an A+, like which one do you have to choose? So I think for me, that's probably where I would likely lean.
Okay. Well, your point is not valid.
Thanks.
My turn. I'm going to start with genre. So we're going to go with RPGs, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say, Jason, which would you recommend for someone? Chrono Trigger or Dragon Quest XI?
Oh shit. I was wondering where you were gonna go. It's like Final Fantasy. Oh man. Chrono Trigger and Chrono Trigger and Dragon Quest XI. Shoot, it's funny because Dragon Quest XI is such a callback to the older series, anyways.
It was really hard to. Well, no, you go ahead, and I'll say that.
Yeah. I am trying to wrap my head around what I would really want someone to play. Oh, geez. I feel like it's funny. I feel like the more approachable game is probably Dragon Quest XI. I think that one's a bit easier to understand. No spoilers. There's some similarities between the two in terms of the plot, but I think that it's probably the overall easier and simpler game to pick up and play and appreciate. And you would probably miss some of the nostalgia notes, obviously, because you haven't played the older games in the series, but you don't miss anything for it. Oh, but Chrono Trigger is its own like standalone title. I think
because we don't talk about Chrono Cross.
Yeah, exactly. What game? No, I think I have to lean towards Dragon Quest 11. I think that's the one I'd recommend to someone that has not played an RPG. I think it's a really solid game, and I think it's really fun, but I think it is one that would likely make someone really want to play more games, and it wouldn't deter them by being a little too dense, a little too difficult, or a little bit confusing.
So I knew I was going to choose Chrono Trigger because it, like we've talked about, it's just one of the best of the best. And then I was thinking, what's another game that's the best of the best? And I know you recently beat Dragon Quest 11.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say Dragon Quest 11 is the best RPG I have played since Final Fantasy 6 and Chrono Trigger. Like, I really just think it's that good. And I don't know if you agree with me, but like, I can't really think of any flaw aside from it's really long, but it's just so good. So I think it was a pretty good balance, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that too. It hits every note correctly.
All right, go for it. Your turn.
Okay, next one. I actually debated on how I was going to ask you this question because I didn't know what would be the most Patrick-y response, but I think I got it down. So if I'm looking at this one, I'm also looking at the beat 'em up genre. And it's not going to sound that weird, but there's lots of years between these games. But
choke me, daddy.
That does sound weird. If you had to choose just one of them for someone to play, would you go with Streets of Rage 3 or Streets of Rage 4?
So this is actually really easy for me.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because Axel is more of a himbo daddy in Streets of Rage 4, and so is Adam. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go with Streets of Rage 4 because the guys are hotter. No, I'm going to go with Streets of Rage 4 completely.
I legitimately believe like that's probably the reason why he wants to do it.
Back in my day, I had to look at pixel booty instead of real booty.
It's funny because you can still look at pixel booty in Streets of Rage 4.
You can. I just really think that Streets of Rage 4 is an experience that builds on the original even more so. And I don't think it's necessarily one of those things where like it's good because it's new. I really just think it adapted itself, kind of like what you were saying for Breath of the Wild. There's just something about the engagement that's a lot better and it's a lot cleaner. So maybe it is because it's newer, but it's just really, really, really good. There aren't any rough edges at all. And I have Streets of Rage 3 and 2 on my like Sega Classics collection.
Yeah.
And like it's still really great and I recommend it highly, but I don't know if I would absolutely be like it's the best beat 'em up because I really think that Streets of Rage 4 now has taken that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that Streets of Rage 4 players are missing anything by not playing the older ones, aside from the nostalgia factor of knowing who those characters are. But I think that the game is so solid on its own right that it really is kind of redefining what that beat 'em up genre can be. And fingers crossed, it's going to create more titles that come back or are made in that vein that we can enjoy.
Yes, please. All of them, all the remakes. And they've been teasing us with the DLC for Streets of Rage 4 for like 2 months now, and we still don't even have a release date.
I know, it's true. But you can look forward to us playing that together. I'm sure we'll get it on like the first week.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right, hit me up with the next one.
Okay, Jason. Would you recommend a game called, which I know you love this game oh so dearly, and I'm really drawing it out for suspense. Would you recommend someone play a party game like Power Stone? Jason just climaxed. Did everybody hear that? Which you're going to have to explain what Power Stone is because I actually had it and played it, but I'm sure a lot of people haven't. So
Power Stone.
Power Stone or Smash Brothers Ultimate.
I knew it. Oh man. Smash Bros. Which one?
I guess it does.
In general?
I just said I guess just Smash Brothers in general because I just picked the newest because it's the most relevant, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
I want to say like Melee, but I didn't want to do the whole like elitist thing, you know.
It's fine. If you haven't played Power Stone, you should. It's a Capcom game. It's a 3D, I guess, fighting brawler basically. So it's in a 3D arena and it can be 4 players all at once, and you're trying to eliminate the other persons by depleting their life bar. But you can get what are called the Power Stones. There's 3 of them, and once you get them, you kind of unlock like a super ability that can do a lot of damage, or
kind of like a Smash Orb,
kind of like a Smash Orb.
Yeah,
exactly. And Power Stone was also known for its really wacky settings and a lot of ridiculous weapons. Like you can pick up golf clubs or water guns or bubble beams. You can throw you can get like roller skates and stuff like that. So it was really fun, and it was a good party game.
It's super fun.
I do think that it gets forgotten too much, and I think that it deserves more recognition from gamers nowadays, people in the past, whatever, because it's really great. But I do think the better game is Smash overall. I think that entire series is better. So I think even if you said like Smash 1 and the N64 versus Power Stone, I would still recommend Smash 1. And I think it's because that game series is just the better fighter. I think that Power Stone is a little bit purposefully probably not balanced. I think that's kind of the point. And you could argue that Smash isn't balanced as well, I suppose. But I do think that taking away all recognition of branded characters that Nintendo has, I think that Smash is still more fun. I think that it offers the more dynamic battles and the more rewarding victories. So defeating your enemies in Power Stone is fun, but defeating them in Smash is fun and very satisfying. So that's why I would go with Smash over that one if you're going to pick one.
I would think that the edge that Power Stone would have is that it's not reliant on all of the other companies that Nintendo is affiliated with, because I think that Smash really has that expectation that people are owed certain games or certain characters to be present when they're not. Like the developers can choose whoever they want to be characters in there, and a game like Power Stone doesn't have that pressure. It's just whoever they created. It's not like they're ripping from other series. So I think that's like a nice little edge that it does have, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it too.
It absolutely does, and I think that you're right. And Falcon and Wang Tang, they're the characters in that game. Like, they're not going to stand up to Mario and Luigi, but I think that in terms of what they're bringing, they're solid for what they are, but I still think that Nintendo has the edge with just the overall fighting and fun of Smash. No one knows about fucking Power Stone. It's sad. I mean, you know about my E3 predictions, right?
Oh, no, we didn't talk about that.
So I have on my Downstab blog, I did a Dream E3 predictions for every year up until literally even this year. And I think this was my 9th or 10th year doing it. Every time, number one is always, every year, it's always the Capcom announces Power Stone 3. And it never happens, but one of these years it's going to happen. All right, well, that was kind of difficult, so I'm going to see if I can throw one back at you that makes it a little more challenging. So we're looking at the Final Fantasy series specifically, not just RPGs. I've heard Final that Fantasy. You might enjoy Final Fantasy. Yeah. So we are looking at picking just one of these games to recommend. So I'm looking at Final Fantasy VI versus Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. No, I'm kidding. Final Fantasy VI versus Final Fantasy 15.
Oh, 6.
But why 6? I know you're gonna pick 6, but I need the why.
That whole ambition and refinement that we were talking about. I like Final Fantasy 15, and they tried really hard to make it feel like a Final Fantasy with the characters, and the music especially is very Final Fantasy. I feel like it's one of the better parts of the game.
Yeah, it's got a huge soundtrack actually.
But like the story is just incoherent. Like, I can tell you, not because I played it so many times, but I can tell you every single plot point of Final Fantasy VI because they made sense. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell you why things are happening in 15. So even from a plot point alone, I just don't think that it's a good game in that respect. It's beautiful, and the battles can be fun and can be engaging, but there's also just something about it that it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy should. Now, if you had compared it to like the Final Fantasy VII remake, then I would struggle a little bit more, because the Final Fantasy VII remake really felt like a Final Fantasy game. And I know it's because it's a remake of a Final Fantasy game, but it's very much so in the same style as 15. So you really could like lose it, because the combat is still very Final Fantasy 15. It's more of an action RPG than a turn-based RPG. It's the 3D graphics, it's the high flashiness, but like then I would have a little bit more trouble to say like which one you should pick up and play. But for this comparison, definitely 6, 100%.
That's a good point with Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I will admit I was being a little bit manipulative because I absolutely knew you would pick 6. And the reason why was because I wanted you to say that it's more of a Final Fantasy game than Final Fantasy 15, because I think it's relevant to this topic. I feel like Final Fantasy grounded itself on that sort of well, to use a good word, of that sort of fantasy and that element that was there of weapons and sorceries and things like that. And you lose it when there's literally like cars rolling around the streets and it's a couple of bros running around. Whatever the newer Final Fantasies may be, they're similar, but they're not quite the same. And I think it reiterates why that golden era of games includes so many Square RPGs like Final Fantasy 4 and 6 and Chrono Trigger, because it really hits that nail on the head of that nostalgia factor for that type of game. And you just don't see too many of those big budget games coming from those same companies anymore. I think that you picked the right choice, and I think that you said it for the right reasons.
Yeah, and like I don't think that Final Fantasy has to be on the fantasy side. I don't mind it when it's science fiction. I think it's fine. Like we have cars in Final Fantasy VIII, and I was talking to my friend Chris, who I talked about in one of our other episodes about this. Like Final Fantasy VIII is a great game until about the end of the second disc, and then when it does its like huge story pivot, not so much, like for a plot alone. But there's just a lot of those things that are just it's as you said, it lost its identity, and it's not like it had to be like solidly this, but it wasn't in the realm of this, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And if it doesn't make sense to you as the listener, you should just play those two games and then you'll understand afterwards.
Yeah. I think it's worth Final Fantasy 15 is still worth playing. You'll still have a good time. It's absolutely beautiful, but it in some aspects it just doesn't feel the same. Okay, but anyways, I digress. I am going to bat one right back at you. This one's kind of funny, and if you know both of these games, you're going to get why it's kind of funny. But Jason, would you recommend?
I would recommend.
Would you recommend to someone Castlevania Symphony of the Night or Bloodstained Ritual of the Night?
Okay, clarification. That was my backup question for you too, so that won't happen.
Hooray, I got to it first.
Symphony versus Bloodstained. Oh man.
Why is that funny first? Tell people why.
Why is it funny, those two games?
Yeah.
I think it's funny because they're largely the exact same game.
Yes.
It's if you don't know, Symphony of the Night is an old Castlevania game on the PS1, and then the creative director, I want to say it was him, largely kind of moved away from the company, blah blah blah. Things happened.
Iga, right?
Iga, yeah. And then history is kind of like, hey, that game was a great game, so he got to Kickstarter and made essentially the same type of game on PS4, Xbox One, and Switch, I think. And that's Bloodstained. So it's largely the same idea. So very very similar. I think that my hot take is to lean towards Symphony, but I do think that Symphony of the Night is overrated for what it is. I don't think it's that great. I do think it's great, but I don't think it's the be all end all greatness of that type of Metroidvania style game. But I would lean towards that one because I think it's a little bit more solid in what it's doing. It even has its quirks and failures that also kind of live up today's standards that are kind of funny, like the really bad voice acting, for example.
This is so bad. What
exactly.
is mad?
Well, yeah, exactly. And I've thought about getting that quote and like framing it and just putting it somewhere so someone could see it and be like, wow, that's like deep. And I'm like, yeah, you don't even know the half of it. So I think that I would lean towards that one. And it's largely because Bloodstained does a lot of stuff that I think you wouldn't get if you didn't play the older games. So I think that you almost have to enjoy and have played Symphony to really get what Bloodstained is doing. Otherwise, you're like, what the fuck is happening? Why do I need to find these extra weapons? I have the strongest weapon when you know, there's better ones out there. Or, you know, that the castle could be completed more than 100%. So I think that with those things in mind, Symphony is probably the better one to play, and I'd recommend that more. And on top of that, the very last thing is it's very well regarded in the gaming community. Lots of people like it, and it would be nice for you as a newbie to jump in and see what they're all talking about, and you will immediately like that game.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those games that even though it's classic, like you can still pick it up. You'll see the references of like what it's spawned since then, but like it's still good enough that you'll enjoy it at the same time. For me, I would have picked the exact same thing for the exact same reasons. I do like Bloodstained. I think it's a great game. The one thing I like a little bit more is the crafting, because any game that has crafting for me is
it's admittedly better.
Yeah, is a good. However, like Symphony of the Night's the one I would have chosen. And a part of the reason why too is Bloodstained almost comes in expecting you to know a history that doesn't really exist yet.
Hmm.
And like there are
True.
the other two Bloodstained games that are more of like the classic Castlevania, where they're like side-scrolling action level based games, but they're not joined together. Like they're the same characters, but they're not the same characters. It's almost like a different universe. Where Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a part of this like complete timeline of Castlevania games that are all connected by Dracula and the Belmont family, and you get to see a lot of those references pop up, and like it all just makes sense. Where again, for Bloodstain, it's like we're throwing in this person because it's almost like they're super important, but they're not the Belmont family, so you know you almost don't feel it as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's completely. I completely get it.
All right, Jason, pitch me another one.
All right. Well, you stole my first backup one, so I have one other. I have
What
one
is a Jason?
a pitiful man. So I have a backup here, and it's a little bit more catered towards what I think you might have enjoyed and played. So we are looking at the original 3 Sonic the Hedgehogs on the Sega Genesis. You could pick anyone that you want; it doesn't matter.
Okay.
But you're comparing them to either of the Sonic Adventure games on the Dreamcast.
Oh, I mean, like, this is almost not fair because the Sonics 1 through 3 are just so good. Like, they are for everyone. Even if you only replay the first level, like, I will say one thing about the original Sonic games that really aren't great, and it's that I think in 2 and 3,
They're just too damn slow, aren't they? They're
Well,
just slow games.
No, 2 and 3, like the second levels are water levels, and I feel like it ramps up the difficulty way too high. But aside from that, those games are just so superior to Sonic Adventures. Like those games are kind of boring. And I played both of them, and like I don't know what it was. It just wasn't, there's something that wasn't fun about it. And we talked about Sonic in our retro revivals episode, and we said like games that either need to stay in their lane or be canceled, and this is like Sonic. A prime example is Sonic 1. I was super surprised like when Sonic had an RPG. I never got to play that game.
It's
on
trash.
The DS.
Don't play it.
Is it okay?
It's trash.
The only, if you would have compared Sonic to Sonics 1, 2, and 3 to Mania, definitely would have struggled, because Mania I am currently playing as like a little side when I want to do something just a little bit quick and hands-on. And Sonic Mania is excellent. Like they completely knocked it out of the park on that one. I would really struggle with what to choose between the two of those. But yeah, definitely the original.
So the reason I bring it up is because I feel like Sonic is in a unique location where he kind of has 2 series, if you will, that people refer to as like the golden era of Sonic. So I think it's these 2 things. So I feel like if you're looking at Sonic the Hedgehog on a 2D basis, you're probably referring to Sonic 2 or 3 or Sonic and Knuckles, those ones. And if you're referring to a good 3D Sonic, I bet you go back to Adventure. So I think it's a good example of like, where do you define Sonic? And I agree with you. I define Sonic with where I grew up, obviously. So it's going to be Sonics 1, 2, and 3. But I will say that Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, I played 2 a little bit more, so I'll lean towards that one. I do think that those are pretty solid games. Are they Sonic games? I'm not sure. But if they're a game where someone started, and I think I heard someone say their first Sonic game was Adventure 2, I'd be like, all right, cool. Like, you got a nice basis for where you can go. It's not quite what I did, but you do have a great place to start. And I think that that's a really unique example of a character that has that.
I just don't think Sonic caters well to 3D, and I like Mario does. And I think it has to do with the element of speed, where, you know, the whole purpose of the game is going fast. And I feel like you don't always want to go that fast in 3D. But that brings me to my final pick or question for you is, speaking of platformers and Mario, Jason, if you had to recommend a game to someone, would you rather recommend Mario 64 or Mario Bowser's Fury?
Oh man.
Did you play Bowser's Fury?
I have not completed Bowser's Fury, but I know exactly what it is. I mean, I have to go with Mario 64. I think that when I'm looking at a game that defines a genre, a system, and just an overall play style, dude, it's Mario 64. There's so many things in that game that still hold up today, that were revolutionary at the time, that people still today don't do as well as that game. It's ridiculous. So I think if you wanted to see a game that is not perfect, but is very, very close to perfect, I think that's probably where you should go. So between those two, even though they're both kind of open world and 3D, obviously, any other comparisons, I think the better game is Mario 64, and that's an easy one for me to choose over Bowser's Fury.
This actually might be the point where we disagree. And originally I was going to put Mario Odyssey, but I'm like, but Odyssey is like a very different game than 64. There's just something about it that's very different. But I feel like Mario Bowser's Fury is kind of similar. And I think Bowser's Fury is the best, like, non-plot heavy Mario game in the 3D universe. I had a blast playing it.
Yeah, I really hope that it is Nintendo's attempt to see, like, testing the water. Do people want this game? Because I absolutely want more of that game. Like, there should be more of those titles like that.
I want more of that world too, because just what they did in the world of that game is so much fun, and everything is cats.
Yeah, exactly.
Everything is cats. Like, could not pick a better theme for me. Everything is cats. They like Mario had me when they made 3D Land and Mario got a cat suit. Like, I was like, I'm sold. Like, you never have to make a Mario game again, because as you get a fucking cat suit. But now you get a full world where all of the monsters are cat themed. There are cats, and you get a cat suit. Like, I don't know how they made it better, but they did it. Like, there is a god, and it's Mario Bowser's Fury.
It's a win-win-win. Okay, before we finish up, I have one other surprise for you, which we're gonna talk about right now.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Oh no!
If you had to pick, and this does not follow the same rules as, you know, the golden era versus the modern era, but if we had to have someone play just one game, and they could only play one, why would it be Mega Man 3 over Mega Man 2?
It would be Mega Man 2 over Mega Man 3.
Okay, so we can cut that out, because it sounds like you said you were going to pick Mega Man 2 over Mega Man 3.
I am going to pick Mega Man 2 over Mega Man 3 because it's the better game.
How is it the better game, Patrick?
The boss masters are better. Mega Man 3, I mean, they're all copies of each other, but like Mega Man 3 is really just a reskin of Mega Man 2. The worlds are better. It's easier to defeat Wily because the weapons to defeat Wily like really make sense as opposed to just being weird.
Are you saying that the top spin was a weird ability to defeat a final boss? Because I disagree.
That is the dumbest weapon.
That's exactly why it was the best one to use to defeat the fucking enemy in the game.
Okay, but I think the real issue is that Mega Man hasn't had a cat suit yet. The end. Close episode.
Okay, gamers, we hope that you enjoyed our little debates there, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think is better, the Golden Era game or the Modern Era game. Let us know over on Twitter and Instagram at HeyRPGaymer. And one other reminder, don't forget to give this podcast a little review on whichever platform you're listening to. It really helps us out.
If you enjoyed listening to us today, be on the lookout for our next podcast, Building the Perfect Survival Horror, coming up soon. If you haven't had the chance yet, head on over to Twitch to catch our latest live streams. We typically stream on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays, but who knows, sometimes the schedule gets crazy. Just make sure you give us a follow. We appreciate you all for listening and hope you had a great time. Now go out there and get gaming in a cat suit and play the classics, preferably Chrono Trigger or A Link to the Past.
Just as long as it's in a cat suit.
Bye-bye.
Oh my god, our cat pooped. It smells.